Hello, everyone. It's the Fair Job podcast here. I'm Richard Palmer.
And I'm Steve Chilcott.
And today we are going to be looking at the manifestos of the other parties, in particular Reform, but we'll also touch on the Green Party, Plaid Cymru, and also the SNP. As you'll know, we've already covered the Tories, the Lib Dems, and the Labour Party. And the Labour Party we've done in some detail, actually, because obviously they were late publishing their manifesto. And that sort of raised some concerns, didn't it, Steve? And I think we're going to be looking in greater depth over the next week or so.
Yeah. We'll take a dip or a dive back into the Labour manifesto and really discuss what some of the real implications are going to be from a Labour government.
So before we kick on, please follow us on YouTube, on Spotify, or whatever your poison is. Also, would like to announce that we are launching our new online store, which means you'll be able to join the Fair Job Initiative and pay monthly rather than having to pay annually. And this, I think, is going to be really exciting for very small employers who are the ones who actually probably need the support that Fair Job Initiative can give more than others. And that membership will start at $19.99 a month. Watch this space. There will be a link down below. It should be live, I think, from Thursday the 20th, but we'll put out an announcement on that. So with that housekeeping aside, it's over to Steve, really, to talk us through the Reform manifesto. Now, if you've got any questions for Steve, do put them in the chat below or do send them in. Steve is a Reform candidate. He is standing for Parliament. So, apply the pincers if you want to find out what's actually, what he really thinks and some robust questioning. We are apolitical. We have different political opinions in our business. But as Steve is a member of Reform, it would be interesting for him to take us through the contract, isn't it, Steve? It's not actually a manifesto.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've avoided the use of the word manifesto, predominantly because we think the words become such a negative considered word that people look at a manifesto and what do they first think of? They think of broken promises. So we're calling it a contract. So a contract basically between the party Reform and the people of the United Kingdom. So the contract was launched on Monday, the 17th of June. So one of the last of the sort of main parties to release their position. And I think probably in terms of headlines around the sort of the world of employment is that Reform want to make work pay and help the unemployed escape the benefits trap. So one of our key headline policies is lifting the minimum income tax threshold. So that's currently £12,570 per annum. We're going to increase it quite significantly to £20,000. And it's not been raised for a long time, which means more and more people are being caught by tax, relative to what the position was 15, 20 years ago. So by raising it to £20,000 per annum, that's going to remove 7 million people from paying tax, and those people being the lowest paid, many pensioners as well, because often pensioners
of course,
are being caught by tax.
The absolutely insane thing about that as well is that they're being taxed and then they're being paid the money back in benefits. So,
right.
It's Kafka couldn't have made it up, really.
Right. And then as well as that, it just being more incentive to people to get back to work. So, they're not caught in that benefits trap. That will save the typical worker £1,500 or just under £1,500 a year, which, in the cost of living crisis, that's what most people are worried about at the moment. And then also we're going to raise Reform are going to raise the threshold for the higher 40% tax rate. So it's currently 37,700, and we're going to increase that very significantly to £70,000 per annum. So you will not be in that higher rate of tax until you hit a salary of £70,000. So that's from the employee perspective, doing very similar for small business as well by reviewing corporation tax. we're going to be lifting the minimum threshold for corporation tax from 50,000, doubling that to 100,000. So that in itself will free 1.2 million businesses from corporation tax. So, the typical small enterprises that we work with, the very small ones, they're going to be huge benefit to them by taking them out of tax. And also reducing the rate of corporation tax from 25% to 20% initially, and then from year 5 to 15%. So, taking an awful lot of very small businesses out of corporation tax completely, and then reducing the rates for those that are still, required to pay corporation tax. So, a very quick, direct benefit for small businesses. And another thing for small businesses, lifting the VAT threshold from 90,000 to 150,000. So again, meaning, the small businesses that we work with are much less likely to be caught in that VAT. And then lastly, in terms of businesses, before we sort of move on to sort of more employer things, completely abolishing IR35, which we know for a lot of sole traders in particular is a very, very significant pain in the backside. So they're some of the key things affecting employees and businesses in terms of tax.
I think what's really interesting with these policies is that they're not actually doing anything other than resetting some of the sliders that have been ignored.
Absolutely. They've been ignored for a long time.
When I first registered for VAT about 30 years ago, I think the threshold was something like 50,000 quid or something. And for it to have only got up to 90,000 in, 35 years is absolutely ludicrous. Absolutely ludicrous. The fact that so many people have been caught in the high rate, in the top rate of tax. And interestingly enough, actually, we'll talk about the Greens and the SNP on that one, because the Greens actually want to put it up for people who are earning over 50,000. And of course, with the SNP, a taxpayer who's earning, £150,000 a year in Scotland, and it slides down a bit, down the closer you get to 50, is paying significantly more than taxpayer in England and Wales, thanks to their, devolved tax raising powers. But anyway, that's very interesting, and I think that it really does sort of reinforce, Reform's position on, wanting to make, to reset things, reset the economy. You're not doing there's nothing outrageous there. That's just, rebalancing things. It seems very
rebalancing and benefiting the small guy or the small woman. It's not focusing on the global corporate conglomerates. No. It's very much focusing on the small people.
And this bit about taking those businesses out of corporation tax, I mean, that's the huge thing, because that would do so much to incentivize entrepreneurship. Because the vast majority of people who want to set a business up, they're not thinking about setting up something that's going to be a major employer. They want to set up something because they want to set up a tree surgery or a small recruitment company or something. They're not going to be earning £500,000 a year, or whatever. They're going to be earning, a couple of $100,000, maybe tops. Most of them are going to be under £150,000. And the reality is that when you cross that £50,000, then, it's stopping people working. I know people who run businesses who, the moment they start getting close to that £50,000 threshold, they stop working because it's not worth their while to cross into it. I mean, that's just crazy. Absolutely crazy. They won't employ people, because if they employ somebody, then that takes them into that turnover. That suddenly it increases their revenue, takes them into turnover. It increases the risk. So, well, that's very interesting.
And like you say, if you're thinking about an employee on a salary of £15,000, I just think the concept of them then paying the state tax from their very low level salary of £15,000 is ridiculous. And I think similarly for, like you say, a tree surgeon who might be, just going over the 90,000, over the 50,000 threshold. Again, that concept of paying corporation tax Corporation. I mean, just look at the name of it,
Yeah,
the name that it
exactly.
has. It's
It
all
was
corporations.
never
It's
aimed
not
at
for
small businesses. Yeah,
quite.
yeah, it is extraordinary, and I do think that one of the things that I think I find very distressing about the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in particular is there doesn't seem to be anyone on their front benches who's championing the small business.
No.
You know, there's in fact, I don't think there's a single one on the Labour front bench who actually knows what it's like to run a small business. Maybe they've got family members who do, but you know, judging by the policies they're wanting to push through, they're not speaking to anybody. You know,
Yeah.
it just highlights, and I think this is where reform are being very clever because this highlights the problem we have of a managerial class who are comfortable with their large salaries, who really don't know how people actually live. I think the other encouraging thing about this corporation tax thing as well is that it acknowledges the fact that we do have a gig economy out there, and a lot of people are having to pick up, run side gigs in order to make ends meet, and anything to encourage that's a good thing because it creates wealth, it creates trade. Yeah, well, no, that is positive. I haven't got any issues with any of that, and in fact, it's very disappointing that other parties aren't doing it. I know the Conservatives did talk about taking people out of tax, but they haven't done anything about it.
No, and of
And
course, you know, the fact that they've not touched these thresholds whilst salaries have been increasing have enabled the Tory government to sit there and say, "Oh, we haven't increased tax levels," when
yeah,
actually
they
they
bloody have.
have.
Yeah,
Well, not even inadvertently. They know full well what they're doing by freezing for many years these thresholds. More and more and more and more people tip in to the scenario of having to pay tax, and that has cost millions, a lot of money.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
you know, the Tories think they can maintain the headline of "we haven't increased taxes," which, let's be honest, is a lie, really.
Yeah.
When you've frozen the thresholds and have not altered them. So, just to mention in passing, some other quick points: scrapping VAT on energy bills, lowering fuel duty by 20p a litre, and scrapping environmental levies. Now, you know, those things again are going to be hugely beneficial for small businesses in
Oh,
particular.
yeah.
You know, going back to your tree surgeon example, who, you know, a lot of his or her costs are going to be the fuel costs of driving his van around to houses to trim their trees, etc. So, you know, that is going to be highly significant and beneficial to a business like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I mean one of the things that I'm very hot on because I live in a rural area. I'm having a bad hair day today. I do apologise because because I live in a rural area. There's no public transport here. There's a bus every once a day. Doesn't really do anything because it doesn't go in rush hour or anything. So and it's a mile away from our house, the nearest stop. And we live in the poorest county in in England, in Northumberland. And one of the reasons why it's the poorest county is because of the costs involved, the costs people have in just getting around the place. You know, fuel is more expensive up here anyway because of distribution costs. And you're paying 5 or 6p more a litre than you'd be paying in, say, London. But then on top of that, you've got no concession to the fact that people have no alternative. And I think I certainly, as a rural person, welcome this is something that would genuinely make life a lot easier. I mean, our major expense after the costs of the housing, our second most expensive cost is diesel and petrol. We are at least 2 tanks a week just getting by up here, and that's a couple of £100 a week just on that, and that's just a normal family doing normal family stuff, with living 10 miles from town. People don't, contrary to what some Labour Party activists seem to believe, people who live in the country don't all ride to hounds. Most of them actually live in poverty. And I don't see anything for rural Britain in the Labour manifesto other than just attacking people's way of life in the country.
And again,
Um,
that probably really highlights that, the Labour Party, who claim to want to deal with poverty, they always seem to assume that poverty exists only in the urban
yeah,
environment, not in the
yeah,
rural environment, because that's invariably where all their focus lays. And
absolutely.
even within the southeast, which again, the southeast of England, people always think, that's the southeast, that's the wealthy part of England. Again, some of the lowest levels of deprivation can be found
Yeah,
in Kent, in places like Farringdon,
absolutely.
for
Yeah.
example. So again, you be very careful, in assumptions like this, and make sure that, if you want to deal with poverty, you are probably properly considering all the different scenarios and places that poverty exists in.
So, and I think that it's very difficult to read polls these days. We know that polls aren't particularly accurate. We know there have been some major shocks for the establishment over the last few years all over the West. And I mean, one of the things I think that both Labour and Conservative are not taking into consideration here is that, as you said, people's main concern is the cost of living. And what are these parties actually doing to address that? And you're getting these broad brushstrokes from Labour without any detail. And when you actually start picking them a little bit, then you start thinking, well, hold on a minute. That doesn't seem right. Why are they doing that? And of course, when you we see it from the Greens as well. There's these broad brushstrokes which haven't been costed out. There's no logic behind them. We're seeing it. As you said, the Conservatives almost seem to have given up, which is just extraordinary to me. That the fact that they seem to be trying to do everything they can now to sort of to counter Nigel Farage, and they've wheeled Boris out. He's looking more dishevelled than ever.
Again, yes, apparently
Yeah.
Boris is writing to a lot of
Oh,
ex-Tory supporters, I hear.
yeah. I got an email from him, and it was just like, sorry, really, 80-seat majority. You didn't do anything. Then you crumbled the moment the media leader witch hunt against you. You resign. You had an 80-seat majority. You could have told them where to go.
Yes,
And that's what people entrusted you with, and you let them down. And I think that I really think that the big parties haven't understood how people feel so incredibly let down by the political establishment.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I really think that the reforms have been very clever here, because they have there's all this sort of sneering attitude you get about aimed at them. Oh, it's Little England. No, it's not. It's nothing to do with Little England. This is people who are trying to live their lives, who are trying to get on with their lives.
yeah, yeah,
Who don't have comfortable public sector jobs or corporate jobs, who are just trying to make ends meet, trying to do the best for their families and their kids.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and it's been a downward spiral for years now.
Mm.
And the tax bill goes up and up.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I think he's on the whole positive. So okay, moving on.
So moving on. So obviously another headline of reforms contract and position is about managing immigration, and basically encouraging the employment of British citizens. And obviously one aspect of that is making sure we have the right support and training to get people back to work, particularly focusing on people 16 to 34. And a specific part of the contract is tax relief for businesses that undertake apprenticeships.
Yeah.
So additional tax relief there. And then, and you might have heard of this because it was headlined before the contract was announced, an employer immigration tax. So this would be raising national insurance to 20% for foreign workers,
Yeah.
with some exclusions. So essential health and social care staff would be completely excluded from that. So, if you run a small private care home and you employ care workers from abroad, you will not have to pay this immigration tax. And also very small businesses who employ 5 or less staff members would not have to pay for this. But anyone other than those 2 main exclusions would have to pay that additional employer's national insurance rate where they employ overseas people. And obviously this is part of, the further desire to encourage the employment of British workers rather than bringing in cheap overseas labour to do work.
Yeah,
So I'm sure there will be differing views on that one. I'm sure, but
well,
I think
it's
there was
a funny
logic
one, isn't
there.
it? Because I think that this was and is actually quite a common situation across the world. Most countries tax their businesses when they employ somebody from overseas to encourage them to hire their own citizens. That's a common practice for nation states, and I know that nation states aren't particularly fashionable among some people these days, but most people who live in Britain still believe in the nation state. So again, I think this is a good score. I think it's very clever also acknowledging the fact that actually until we sort out our training in the care sector, until we address how we actually run our care sector, which is a massive project, and until we actually address some of the problems that we have with the NHS, we are very dependent on overseas workers, and it's a clever angle to take. Have they got anything about education? Because most people who come into the country seem to be coming on education visas, and then bringing family members with them. And it's actually, when we looked at the figures, I think it's like 40% of people who actually come to the country come on education. It's not actually the boats that the problem is. The universities peddling.
So we completely back, and I think the Conservative Party have already announced this themselves, of removing the right of people coming here on student visas to bring dependents. I think it was Nigel Farage who made the comment, though, that if you're coming to study in Britain, you really shouldn't need your mum with you. That concept quite friend. Obviously, people were there were some people bring their entire families. That is a nonsense. So certainly that is something that the reform would be hot on, and making sure that the whole scenario of student visas and colleges and universities, etc., is properly regulated, because there are still scams going on. And so I know people here on student visas are only enabled to work for a certain amount of hours, and again that's quite widely abused as well. So making sure that is properly regulated and managed.
So we if you remember, a few weeks ago we met a chap who works in the education sector, and he consults with universities around training young people in the soft skills that they need to survive in the workplace. And he said that he'd engaged with a Surrey-based university. Actually, it was a Berkshire-based university, and this university admitted to them that they only have something like a 45% attendance rate at lectures, and the reason for this is because 65% of the students at the university are from overseas. And sometimes these students will turn up, they'll register, and they never see them again. The moment they get the visa, they're off. They're not interested in doing a degree. So they're basically paying university fees in order to get a visa to come to Britain, and then of course bringing dependents over as well. It's a colossal scam.
Yeah,
and I haven't seen the Labour Party don't seem to be planning to address it at all.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, whilst we're on the subject of education, just going off on that on a tangent for a moment, there's not many universities in Britain currently that offer 2-year degrees. So that is something that Reform are going to be quite strong about encouraging 2-year degrees. And
Yeah,
also
that's
just
a good idea.
moving away from this nonsense that, everyone's got to go to university. That, we need to reduce our university places, numbers, courses, and probably institutions, frankly.
I think that this. I remember you and I are old enough to remember John Major's policies around getting everybody in university education, and I remember back then being a sort of spotty 25-year-old or whatever saying this was a really stupid idea, and having just recently returned from a trip to Germany where I'd seen how well the technical education works in Germany. So in
Yeah.
Germany, as a sort of 16-year-old, you go to the gymnasium, or you go to the technical school. And if you go to the gymnasium, you are going down an academic arts route. You go down the technical school, you go down the technical, and it's streamed at that point. And what's very interesting about Germany is that the technical professions, and that includes stuff that you do with your hands, are given the same amount of respect than any other profession is. You get the same amount of respect, and you can certainly tell if you ever interact with a German mechanic or a factory worker. They're usually pretty impeccably turned out. They're pretty well educated. They're on top of their game. They're highly motivated, and they're well paid. And I think this is a hangover from our class system, like so much stuff that we have in this country.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to two final areas. So one is around equality, EDI. So reform will replace the 2010 Equalities Act, particularly around the positive action aspect of the Equality Act, which, as we know, often can be a troublesome area. So, as you and I know, Richard, currently under the Equalities Act, there are certain scenarios where an organisation can actively discriminate under certain provisions, so that would go under a reform government. And again, we would look closely at the whole area of EDI to make sure that it isn't ultimately reducing economic productivity. It isn't being a negative impact on organisations, and that where it is done for sound evaluated reasons. So that would be an area for close review. So not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but just making sure that it's done in a sensible, pragmatic way.
And this is music to my ears, and I think yours as well, Steve, because one of the biggest challenges that we have at Fair Job is helping our smaller businesses navigate EDI, which is being imposed on them by corporate procurement and public sector procurement rules. We've got a situation at the moment where 65% of British workers have been trained in some form of EDI. 62% of British workers work in small businesses. So why are small businesses training EDI into their people where they're training it? Because they have no choice. They have to do it in order to meet procurement demands. Now the what that means in short to our lay people listeners is that if you want to sell paperclips to an NHS trust, then you have to make sure that your business has an EDI policy and also trains everybody in EDI. And if you don't do that, then you can't even apply to be considered to be a supplier of those paperclips. This is what the World Economic Forum has been up to in terms of pushing what's called the ESG, the environment, social, and governance agenda on the corporate world, and it's also in the public sector. Now, it's important because we know from the number of reports that have been published since March this year. So there's been one by the government themselves, there's been one by the Free Speech Union using Donata, and there's been another one by the Policy Exchange. And we know that all three of those reports, which are very, very well written and very objective, clearly state that the implementation of DEI has been an absolute disaster for the British workplaces and British economy on the whole. Now, this is beginning to sink in the corporate world. Unfortunately, it's not sinking in the Labour Party. The Labour Party want to make this a statutory requirement. So it'll be driven through, EDI will be driven through statutory procurement rules. So if we are facing a Labour government, which is looking likely, then it's really important that we help you guys, when you're running your businesses, to navigate what this means for you. Because if you do EDI badly, and don't get me wrong, we've got fairly strong opinions on EDI, and whether or not it should be used at all. But if you do it badly, which is very easy to do because most EDI available from third parties available is pretty bad, you can really damage your business. So it's really important, if you are in that situation, that you get in touch if you want any advice as to how to navigate this and how to make sure you can meet the requirements that the public sector, the corporates, Labour Party putting on you and your business without damaging your business. So a bit of a segue there, but really important, folks. And I'm very pleased to see here that Reform are actually tackling this head on, because it has to be tackled head on. And I think so many people are nervous about tackling it head on because they think they're going to be shut down. Well, actually, we know what the evidence is. It's been a disaster. And in fact, it's been a bigger disaster for BAME people and also LGBT people as well. So it's not doing anyone any favors.
Absolutely. So the last subject, which that I'm going to mention, which isn't a direct aspect of employment law, but it's something that's definitely at the heart of what Fair Job UK stands for, and that's around free speech. So Reform are going to propose a comprehensive free speech bill, which will legislate against things like cancel culture, debanking, hate mobs, political bias in public institutions and procurement policies, etc., etc. So again, as far as I'm aware, I think the only political party that are explicitly talking about that, you might think the Lib Dems might, but I don't recollect seeing it.
I think they've got something in there, actually, the Lib Dems. I think there was something in there, yeah. They seem to be quite enlightened on this.
Yes, it's one of the things that the Lib Dems do seem to be enlightened on.
The Liberals being liberal again, that's unusual, isn't it?
I know. Who would have thought?
They'll be being democratic next.
Yes. So that's kind of some of sort of relevant business employment aspects of the Reform contract. Now, again, you might say, well, why are we bothering talking about this? Because, of course, Reform themselves are sensible enough to know Reform are not going to be forming the government. We're not going to have huge numbers of MPs either. However, Reform will be getting millions of votes, and therefore I think Reform will be in a position to hold others' feet and hands to the fire, frankly, on some of these issues.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think if one of the things I think has been so forgotten conveniently by the Conservative Party and also by some of the press, I noticed the Telegraph was making a very strange point this morning about this, is that the Telegraph was trying to crow that Boris was a great idea wheeling Boris out because Boris had neutered the UKIP in the 2019 elections, and I mean, I don't quite know what the Telegraph were trying to say here, because the only reason why Boris neutered Farage in the last elections was because UKIP agreed to stand down their candidates against the Tory party. That was the only reason. There wasn't any it wasn't because of policy or anything. It was very specifically to do with Brexit and getting Brexit through. Now I think that if Reform can score over 8-9 million votes, maybe more than that, it doesn't really matter if they don't turn that into many seats, because that is a huge democratic deficit against the two-party system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one of the things that people turn around and say, "Oh well, hold on a minute. We had a debate about proportional representation, 10 years ago, 14 years ago, and when the coalition government came in and it was rejected, there was we had a plebiscite, it was rejected. Well, yeah, but that was 14 years ago. The world has changed considerably, and if you look at both Labour and Conservative since then, both parties have been tearing each other apart since then. You've had the Conservatives been tearing each other apart over Brexit, and they're not united at all. Do not for 1 minute try to convince anybody that Keir Starmer's party is united. There's massive civil war in the Labour Party. And you can see that. I mean, you can see it. It sort of peeps through the gaps on his manifesto document all over the place. And I think that both Reform and the Liberal Democrats and the Greens have actually got a very strong position here around saying that we need, as a democracy, to move towards a PR system. And I get all the criticisms about Weimar, and what happened in Germany and blah, 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 we've been through that. But the reality is we're now an outlier. The only other country that has a system is Belarus.
Yes, in Europe, in the continent of
Yeah.
Europe, that's in Belarus.
Yeah, I mean, we have PR in this country already. We've got it in Scotland and Wales. And actually, one of the problems that Scotland's had is because it's got this sort of slightly strange system where their domestic government is PR and the other bit isn't. And yeah, I mean, I think that even if Reform don't win that many seats, it will simply galvanize the conversation around that. And at some point, the two big parties cannot morally hold on to power. I think that if you look at what's happened to this Conservative Party and this Conservative government, and you also look to see what's happened in Ireland with Varadkar's party as well, and also across various European countries, those politicians who've taken an absolute thumping, or who are facing a thumping like Rishi Sunak is, they all have one thing in common, which is they lack a plebiscite. They haven't stood. They never stood for election. They were appointed into their roles by their parties or by some sort of banker coup, like what happened with Sunak. So whether or not you agreed with Liz Truss or not, I mean, it was a bit crazy that the Conservative Party could oust a 80-seat majority prime minister and then have an internal election to replace him, but then to oust that winning candidate and replace them with somebody who just happened to be liked by Goldman Sachs. That's why the Tories are facing this now, because they have drifted the pursuit of power away from the democratic accountability. And I think that, from a broader political perspective, this is very interesting. The sad thing is, though, is that I think, you and I, we I'm not a member of any political party, and I'm fairly politically agnostic. You're a member of Reform, and you're standing for Parliament. But there are some basic things about common sense here, and there's some basic things about, what is government for, and one of the things that I very concerned about with Mr. Starmer is the flip flopping, the being nice, being saying what everybody wants to hear. So last week he was busy telling everybody how his government, how he thinks that politicians have been treading too heavily in people's lives and they need to tread lighter. And that's a very good point. They do. But he then goes on to produce the new worker deal, which stamps all over potentially, the small businesses, which is where most people work in the country. So how the hell is that treading lightly? It's more legislation. People are fed up of politicians being, they need to do something. No, don't do anything. Just govern. Just you look after the defence. You look after the flow of capital and the trade agreements. So we'll do everything else. We don't need you to do it. Anyway, I'm rant over.